Thank you and welcome to the Goodman Acker Show. I'm Jordan Acker, your host, and Johnny Hamoud will be joining us next week. Today, we're going to talk about a few legal issues, a lot of things that we deal with at Goodman Acker, including slip and falls and, of course, wage loss when you're in an auto accident. Now, just as a reminder, you can reach our attorneys anytime, day or night, at 248-483-5000. Someone will take your calls. Today, we have a very special guest here in studio, Kevin Komar, one of the senior attorneys at Goodman Acker. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure being here, Jordan. It's nice seeing you again.
Thank you, Kevin.
It's been a few hours.
Indeed it has. So, let's talk about one of the big areas of practice that we deal with at Goodman Acker, slip and fall law. So we hear all the time on the news about things like open and obvious, but in Michigan today, what is a slip and fall case? What is actionable?
Well, you know, what's strange is you bring this topic up and we're in one of the worst winters we've ever had. I mean, I'm going to be 40 years old this year, and I remember winters in the 70s and the 80s when we would just get dumped on with snow all the time, and this is by far the worst winter. So we're getting phone call after phone call about people that are calling. They want to know, well, what can I do in the event that there's been a slip and fall? What can I do? What are my rights? And it's kind of important to know that over the last 10 years or so, that the number of cases and where you can bring these cases is now severely limited. It used to be that you could bring a case, little old lady shows up to CVS, she's got to get her heart medication, and she slips and falls in the parking lot at CVS. She's got to get her medication that day. She's got no other choice. That's where her medication is at. Years ago, that used to be something that was actionable, meaning that you could bring that lawsuit. But today, that lawsuit is no more. Instead, there's a few elements you have to focus on with a slip and fall, and one of those elements has to deal with exactly where you fell. Mm-hmm. And right now, one of the big areas that's still alive in Michigan is slipping and falling actually at an apartment complex, and specifically on the sidewalks. What's unique about an apartment complex versus your own home is that in an apartment complex, you sign a lease, you don't own that property, you don't own that sidewalk. So the big problem is that you have to rely upon a landlord who may or may not care, and you may have one way in and one way out of that apartment, and that's it. Where if it's your own home, you can go out, you can spread salt, ice melt, whatever chemical you want to on your driveway, on your walkway. But in an apartment complex, you don't have that. As a matter of fact, there are some leases that say, you can't do any snow removal at all. Mm-hmm. We don't want you to touch it at all. So that's why in Michigan, right now, the biggest bastion in terms of slip and fall cases has to in fact deal with slip and falls at apartment complexes.
So does that deal with just the owner, or does it also deal with an invited guest?
Well, it depends on the circumstances, what type of property that you have, if you are an invited guest, if you're on the lease, if you're a visitor, if you've been staying there for a while. Because there's plenty of situations where people are actually renting a property, such as a small home, a single-family home, and they may have grandma who shows up that day. And in that case, grandma has her slip and fall on the property. In that case, that is something that we would still look at in terms of actually filing a lawsuit. The people who are actually the tenants who are on that lease, they have every right to bring that lawsuit. They have every right to do that in the event that they're hurt on that property.
Okay, so you know, something we hear about a lot from a lot of other plaintiffs' firms is, well, we don't even touch premises cases anymore because we're not sure. I mean, what is the status of Goodman Acker? What do we do differently than those other plaintiffs' firms?
Well, in the way that it used to work is that other plaintiffs' attorneys would file these lawsuits, and then they would give the deposition of their plaintiff, and they wouldn't dig that hard into what was actually happening at the property. But that's one of the big issues that we always delve into is, why did the person slip and fall? Why was there an accumulation of ice there? Because a lot of times the accumulation of ice is there not because of just a natural accumulation of snow that fell, or the thaw and the refreeze, but it might have to do with the fact that there is no gutter, a leaky gutter. You might have potholes on the property that have a tendency to form ice, and that's something that the owners know about because they're there day in and day out. Whereas if you're a tenant, you show up, and you have a slip and fall, you may have only lived there a month or 2 months, so you
Sure.
don't know the nuances of this property.
So changing gears for a second, let's talk about something that we hear about all the time, something I mentioned briefly at the top of the show. And again, Goodman Acker attorneys are reachable 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 248-483-5000 if you have any questions about your specific case. So we hear about this doctrine of open and obvious. But why don't you explain to our viewers today, what is open and obvious?
Sure. Open and obvious, the way that I always analogize this and the way that I tell the jurors to think about this is you think of your typical parking lot and it's black asphalt, right? And take a yellow pad of paper, a legal pad, and then you put that yellow pad of paper in this black asphalt parking lot. It's there to be seen. It's something that you can see and it's something that you walk around. Now let's take it into the winter scenario and you have all of these patches of ice that are all over the place in Michigan in these asphalt parking lots, and you can actually see that the ice is definitely a different color than the asphalt. Now in that scenario it's open and obvious. In that scenario it's our job as residents of the state of Michigan, where we have ice potentially here for 4 months out of the year.
Right.
It's our job to avoid that. It's our job to walk around that. And if we were to file that lawsuit, that gets dismissed. However, if you are faced with an unavoidable situation, such as you walk out of your office building, which you've been in for 8 hours throughout the course of the day, you walk out that front door, and there's nothing in between you and your car but a sheet of ice. Well, in that scenario, you're faced with an unavoidable situation. So even though that ice is there to be seen, there's no way around it, and you can't sleep in your office at night.
No, you definitely cannot, even though we know some have tried. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about a different topic. We're going to talk about what happens with your wages if you're involved in an auto accident when we return on the Goodman Acker Show.
After the accident,
I needed action fast.
I couldn't afford second best.
There was only one opportunity to get this right.
I called Goodman Acker.
I got almost $350,000.
Insurance company told me I'd only get 10.
$75,000.
I got almost $250,000.
$600,000.
They started working for me.
Fast.
Fast.
They mean business.
Power.
Power.
Success.
The insurance company knew their name.
Goodman Acker.
لتضمن حقوقك كاملة اتصل اليوم بمكتب المحامي جودمان أكر.
And welcome back to the Goodman Acker Show, brought to you by Goodman Acker, 248-483-5000, your choice for personal injury. So we're here today with one of the senior attorneys in our law firm, Kevin Komar. Kevin, thank you so much again for joining us today.
No problem. Anytime, Jordan.
So switching gears from what we talked about in the previous segment, we talked a little bit about slip and falls. And again, if you have a question about a slip and fall, please call our attorneys at 248-483-5000. So Kevin, let's talk about something we touched on briefly last week with Johnny and Brad. We talked a little bit about the benefits that you get if you're involved in an auto accident, the so-called first party benefits, the PIP benefits.
Sure.
And one of those things that we talked about was the wage loss. So people ask all the time, what am I entitled to? So Kevin, first of all, what are you entitled to in case you're involved in an automobile accident?
Sure. The first thing that a lot of people ask us as soon as there's an automobile accident is they want to know specifically what am I entitled to. And the first thing that they always ask us is, well, what about pain and suffering? What about pain and suffering? But a lot of people don't know that when you have a car accident, there's actually more benefits that you're entitled to under your own automobile insurance policy or an auto policy of a family member that you actually live with. And one of those benefits actually has to do with what's referred to as lost wages. One of the catastrophic problems that people always face when it comes to an automobile accident is they may not have any form of disability policy at work. They may be working at an hourly rate. They may be working at a job where they have absolutely no benefits. Now, if in fact you're hurt in a car accident and your doctor says, as a result of this car accident and your injury from this car accident, I don't want you working, then your own automobile insurance policy has to pay you 85% of the money that you would have earned had the accident not happened. And the classic example I tell everybody is that if you're earning $100 a day and you're hurt in a car accident and your doctor says, I don't want you working, then your own automobile insurance company or another automobile insurance company that's determined by the statute in Michigan that determines priorities, they have to pay you $85 out of that $100 you would have earned, and it's tax-free. So it's not like you have to turn around and pay taxes again on money that an automobile
good.
insurance company has already paid you. So that's one thing that's great about Michigan no-fault law, is that it actually acts as a short-term disability policy, well, actually long-term, for 3 years during the time that you're actually incapable of working because of a car accident.
Oh, that's really interesting. So another question that we get asked all the time is, I'm a waiter, I'm a waitress, I get paid in cash, I get paid in tips at the end of each night. What about me? How do I get taken care of in this kind of situation?
Yep, that you can do that too. Now, just because you're not an employee that receives a regular paycheck at the end of every week, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a way that we can't reconstruct wage loss for you. As a matter of fact, a lot of people will try to work with the insurance company themselves, and the insurance companies will, in fact, if you're a waitress and you're earning tips, then what they do is we can gather records for you from your employer, because your employer, obviously, they want to know how much you're earning in tips.
Right.
And in a lot of situations, your employer actually collects the tips and they distribute them evenly. So there will be records from your employer, or records that you have, that you can show, this is how much I earned in tips typically. And then what you do is you go back and you take an average of what this person may have earned over a period of time prior to their accident, and you can still reconstruct wage loss for them underneath their automobile insurance policy.
So I don't need to necessarily have a W-2 or a 1099 or any other tax forms to get wage loss benefits?
No, you don't. As long as you have proof of some kind of employment, that you have your employer says, yes, this person worked here, they were paid an hourly rate, or this is the average amount of tips that they got, or they did in fact receive tips, and you've got some documentation to show, well, these are the tips I would have earned, these are my average tips from the last 30 days that I worked, then you can still present that to an automobile insurance company. And in fact, they have paid us based upon those types of reconstructions.
It's interesting. So let me ask you another question that we get all the time. So what if I'm recently unemployed and I'm looking for a new job? What about me? Am I entitled to any wage loss benefits?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we have something in Michigan that's referred to as temporary unemployment. And the way that this came about, and everybody knows this in the state of Michigan, is that we are highly dependent upon the automobile industry, and a lot of these jobs are union jobs, and a lot of these jobs have mandatory shutdowns. People will be laid off for 2 weeks during the summer, a month, and during that time frame when they're laid off, a lot of these people will go do other jobs. They might be a bartender, they might do something else. So in Michigan, if you have been terminated from employment, whether you're laid off, whether you've lost the job, the factory shut down, for whatever reason, if you're out of a job and you're actively searching for employment and you're hurt in a car accident after you lose that job, well, you're temporarily unemployed according to the law, and you can still receive wage loss benefits, because a lot of people in the state of Michigan, as you'll probably hear from Mr. Mark Brewer at a later point in time, maybe in this program, is that there are a lot of people who, we are not specifically 9 to 5, 40 hours a week. Some of us may work 60 hours a week 1 week, and then the factory says, okay, we'll see you again in 5 days, and you'll work another 20 hours. And oh, by the way, you're laid off in that time frame. So you're temporarily unemployed.
Interesting. So is there a maximum amount that you can get under Michigan no-fault law?
Yeah, well, unfortunately that there is. The way that it works in Michigan is that the state of Michigan actually will set a maximum amount that you can receive for wage loss benefits. There are people that's referred to as a max wage loss earner. So if in fact you are earning above a certain amount of money in the state of Michigan, then unfortunately the state of Michigan will cap the amount of money that you can actually receive. However, just because you did have a job, you were earning quite a bit of money, and you became disabled, doesn't necessarily preclude you from any wage loss benefits.
Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today and answering all the questions about wage loss and about slip and falls. Remember, if you have any question about these or any other legal topics, you can reach Kevin or any other Goodman Acker attorney at 248-483-5000. Now, when we come back for the final segment here on this week's Goodman Acker Show, we'll have a conversation with Goodman Acker attorney and former Michigan Democratic Party Chair, Mark Brewer.
After the accident,
I needed action fast.
I couldn't afford second best.
There was only one opportunity to get this right.
I called Goodman Acker.
I got almost $350,000.
Insurance company told me I'd only get 10.
$75,000.
I got almost $250,000.
$600,000.
They started working for me.
Fast.
Fast.
They mean business.
Power.
Power.
Success.
The insurance company knew their name.
Goodman Acker.
لتضمن حقوقك كاملة اتصل اليوم بمكتب المحامي Goodman Acker.
And welcome back to the Goodman Acker Show. In this, our final segment of today's show, we have a very special guest, former Michigan Democratic Party chair and current Goodman Acker attorney, Mark Brewer. Mark, thanks so much for joining me today.
Glad to be with you.
So, tell us a little bit about yourself. You know, we see you on all the time on TV talking politics, but we don't really get to know Mark Brewer, the man. So, tell us a little about your background.
Well, my dad was in the Navy for 20 years, and when he retired from the Navy, we moved to Michigan. That was back in 1970. I went to Mount Clemens High School, graduated from there, went off to Harvard for college, Stanford for law school, where I learned to really love practicing labor law, the whole idea of representing working people. And so Michigan is one of the best places in the country to do that. So I came back home to Michigan after I wrapped up law school.
Oh, that's really interesting. So after law school, where did you work?
Well, I actually worked for judges for a couple of years as what's called a clerk, where you assist the judge in their work. I did that in Texas for a year, and then for the Michigan Supreme Court as well. Those are terrific experiences before I started practicing law.
Must have been a much different Supreme Court in those days than it is now.
Yes, oh yes, a much more even-handed, fairer court than we've got now.
That's really interesting. So tell us a little bit. So you were party chair for a number of years. What was the most interesting experience you had on a campaign?
Well, I got started in politics right after high school. I was David Bonnier's first summer intern, and David's been a great champion of the Arab American, Chaldean, and other communities in the state for a long, long time, and I learned a lot from him. He's really been a political mentor.